Behind Conway Twitty's legendary career lay a family torn apart by tragedy, bitter legal wars, and shocking personality changes. From a teenage daughter tricked into recording a controversial duet, to children who lost their inheritance empire in devastating court battles, to a son carrying on his father's legacy after a traumatic head injury changed everything. Here's what really happened to Conway Twitty's children. Michael Twitty. Michael Twitty carries the weight of being Conway Twitty's firstborn son, a child born from circumstances that would shape both his life and his relationship with one of country music's biggest legends. His story begins in 1953, when Conway Twitty, then still known by his birth name Harold Jenkins, married 18-year-old Ellen Matthews in what was essentially a shotgun wedding after she became pregnant with Michael. The marriage lasted barely a year, ending in divorce in 1954 when Michael was still an infant. But this early upheaval would define much of Michael's childhood experience. While Conway went on to build his massive country music empire, Michael grew up largely without his famous father, who was constantly on the road, performing, recording, and building the career that would make him a household name across America. Rather than feeling abandoned or resentful about his father's absence, Michael developed a unique perspective on family that he would later describe in deeply emotional terms. He wrote about having what he called 3 dads during his formative years, a support system that included his grandfather, known as Papaw, who had been a steamboat captain on the mighty Mississippi River, his uncle Howard, and Conway himself, even though Conway's presence was often limited to daily phone calls from whatever city he happened to be performing in that night. Michael began performing with his father as early as age 8, appearing on stage during Conway's shows, which gave him an early taste of the music industry that would eventually become his own career path. By the 1970s, Michael had signed his first recording contract and began releasing his own music, cutting at least 2 singles for Capitol Records, titled Mississippi Rolling Stone and The Closest Thing to You. Like many children of famous performers, Michael also experimented with stage names, recording several songs under the name Charlie Tango, including his own version of The Gambler. His 1984 album Ramblin' Man was particularly significant because it featured Conway as both producer and guest vocalist, representing one of the few times father and son collaborated professionally on record. As Conway's career continued to soar through the 1980s, Michael found his own musical path, eventually transitioning into what he describes as paying homage to his father rather than simply imitating him. He has consistently maintained that people tell him he has mannerisms, looks, and vocal qualities similar to Conway, but insists this similarity is natural rather than calculated, explaining that he grew up as his father's biggest fan, watching and listening to every move Conway made. The most profound moment in Michael's relationship with his father came on the night of June 5, 1993, the day Conway died suddenly from an abdominal aneurysm. Michael describes having a vivid dream that night, and when he woke up, he was overwhelmed by the scent of English leather cologne, Conway's signature fragrance, so strong it made him dizzy. What made this experience particularly meaningful to Michael was that he had never liked the cologne and never kept any in his house, leading him to interpret the experience as a direct message from his father that he would always be present in Michael's life. Since Conway's death, Michael has dedicated much of his career to preserving his father's musical legacy, performing tribute shows and working alongside his own son, Trey, who has also entered the music business. Michael signed his first major label deal in 1972 and has maintained a decades-long career, but at age 55, he has shifted his focus toward keeping his father's memory alive rather than pursuing his own stardom, often saying that as long as audiences continue to react positively to Conway's music, he will keep performing it. Joanie Lee Twitty. Joanie Lee Twitty became the most musically successful of Conway Twitty's children through what can only be described as an elaborate deception orchestrated by her own father when she was just 16 years old. Born on July 2, 1957, Joanie Lee was Conway's first child with his second wife Temple Mickey Medley, and she grew up watching her father's meteoric rise to country music superstardom throughout the 1960s and 70s. For years, Joanie Lee had expressed interest in following in her father's musical footsteps, but Conway was deeply reluctant to let her pursue a singing career after witnessing the struggles of his other children, Michael and Kathy, who had both tried to make it in country music with limited success. Conway had seen firsthand how difficult it was for the children of famous performers to establish their own identities and achieve genuine success, rather than simply riding on their parents' coattails. Despite his reservations, Conway had written a song years earlier called "Don't Cry, Joanie," and eventually decided that allowing his teenage daughter to duet with him might provide the encouragement she needed, while also testing whether she had the talent necessary for a professional music career. The song told the story of a 15-year-old girl named Joanie, who develops a romantic crush on her 22-year-old neighbor named Jimmy, pleading with him to wait for her until she grows up so they can eventually marry. What happened next would become one of the most controversial aspects of Joanie Lee's brief recording career and her relationship with her father. Conway asked his daughter to join him in the recording studio, telling her they were going to cut a rough demo version of the song that he would later have someone else re-record with a professional singer. Joanie Lee later recalled in an interview with Billboard magazine that she had no idea she was actually recording the final version that would be released to the public, explaining that her father had essentially tricked her by saying he planned to take her voice off the track and replace it with an established vocalist. The deception worked, and Conway released "Don't Cry, Joanie" as a single in August of 1975 from his album The High Priest of Country Music. The song became a massive hit, reaching number 4 on the Billboard Country Singles chart and even crossing over to number 63 on the pop charts, making it one of only 2 non-Loretta Lynn duets in Conway's career to achieve major commercial success. The success of "Don't Cry, Joanie" launched Joanie Lee's own recording career, and she signed with MCA Records in 1976 to release a self-titled solo album under the stage name Joanie Penn. Her most successful solo single was "I'm Sorry, Charlie," which peaked at number 16 on the Hot Country Songs chart. But despite this moderate success, she was never able to replicate the massive impact of her duet with her father. The subject matter of "Don't Cry, Joanie" would later draw criticism from some listeners who felt the song's storyline about a teenage girl pursuing an adult man was inappropriate, especially given that it featured an actual teenage girl singing the role. This controversy, combined with the circumstances of how she was manipulated into recording the song, created a complex legacy for what should have been Joanie Lee's breakthrough moment in country music. Today, Joanie Lee Riles, as she is now known, has stepped away from pursuing her own recording career and is married to John Wesley Riles, a respected session musician and songwriter who has worked throughout Nashville's music industry. She remains the most prominent of Conway Twitty's children in terms of musical recognition, though her story serves as a reminder of how the music industry and family dynamics can intersect in ways that profoundly shape a young person's life and career trajectory. Kathy Twitty. Kathy Twitty transformed herself into Jessica James and became the most defiant fighter in one of country music's most bitter family feuds, ultimately losing the home and legacy her father had promised would keep his family together forever. Born as one of Conway's 3 children with his second wife Mickey Medley, Kathy grew up in the shadow of her father's enormous success, but was determined to carve out her own place in the music industry through sheer talent and perseverance. Following the pattern of her siblings, Kathy adopted a stage name and began performing as Jessica James, later spelled Jessica James, in an attempt to establish her own musical identity separate from the overwhelming presence of the Conway Twitty name. Her performances under this persona were captured on television shows like Pop Goes the Country, where she demonstrated her vocal abilities and stage presence, showing that musical talent clearly ran in the family. The most significant chapter of Kathy's musical career came when she joined a remarkable supergroup called The Next Generation, which brought together the daughters of some of country music's most legendary performers. The group featured Kathy alongside Peggy Lynn, daughter of Loretta Lynn, Georgette Jones, daughter of George Jones and Tammy Wynette, and Cindy Cash, daughter of Johnny Cash, creating an unprecedented gathering of country music royalty's next generation. This collaboration represented something unique in country music history, as these women shared the common experience of growing up as children of superstars and understanding the particular challenges that came with trying to establish their own careers while carrying such famous surnames. The group gave Kathy a platform to perform alongside peers who faced similar struggles with identity and expectations in the music industry. When Conway died suddenly in June of 1993, Kathy's life took a dramatically different turn as she found herself thrust into the role of fierce advocate for her father's final wishes. Conway had built Twitty City as more than just a tourist attraction, envisioning it as a place where his family could live together permanently, with individual homes for each of his children surrounding his own mansion, creating what he called a family compound, where they would always be close. The estate battle that followed Conway's death became a devastating 14-year legal nightmare that would consume much of Kathy's adult life and drain the family's resources. Conway had failed to update his will after marrying his fourth wife, Dolores D. Henry, in 1987, which meant that Tennessee law entitled her to 1/3 of his estate, despite not being mentioned in his will. Kathy emerged as the most vocal and determined of Conway's children in fighting against what they saw as an attempt by their stepmother to claim far more than her legal share of their father's legacy. She spoke publicly about the battle, explaining that they were fighting not just for money, but for their father's explicit wishes that his musical legacy and property rights remain within his bloodline for future generations. The legal conflict escalated when D. Henry and the estate executors sided against Conway's children, leading to court battles over everything from the children's right to continue living in their Twitty City homes to their father's awards and memorabilia. Kathy watched helplessly as a judge issued a restraining order barring Conway's heirs from the property, ultimately forcing all 4 children and their 81-year-old grandmother to move out of the homes Conway had specifically built for them. The most emotionally devastating moment came when the entire contents of Twitty City were put up for public auction, including personal letters, photographs, and intimate family memorabilia that told the story of Conway's life and career. Kathy later described this experience as being almost as hard as losing their father again, watching strangers bid on the physical reminders of their family's history and their father's incredible career in country music. Jimmy Twitty. Jimmy Twitty chose silence over stardom, becoming the most elusive and private of Conway Twitty's 4 children. By deliberately avoiding the country music industry that made his father a legend, as the youngest child born to Conway and his second wife, Temple Mickey Medley, Jimmy grew up during the height of his father's career in the 1970s and 80s, watching his siblings attempt to follow in Conway's musical footsteps while he quietly decided that path was not for him. Unlike his brothers and sisters who all pursued recording careers and stage performances, Jimmy made a conscious choice to stay away from the country music spotlight, appearing to understand from an early age that the pressure and expectations that came with the Twitty name might not be worth the potential rewards of musical fame. While his siblings, Michael, Joanie Lee, and Kathy all signed recording contracts and performed publicly throughout the 70s and 80s, Jimmy remained largely in the background, supporting his family's musical endeavors without seeking his own place on stage. Jimmy's decision to avoid the music industry became even more significant after his father's sudden death in June of 1993, when the family was thrown into a devastating legal battle that would consume more than a decade of their lives. As the youngest of Conway's children, Jimmy found himself caught in the middle of the bitter estate dispute between his siblings and their stepmother, Dee Henry. Watching as the family unity his father had worked so hard to create was torn apart by lawyers, court hearings, and conflicting claims over Conway's multi-million-dollar legacy. The most traumatic experience for Jimmy came when he was forced to leave the home his father had specifically built for him at Twitty City, the elaborate family compound Conway had created in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Conway had envisioned Twitty City as a place where his children would always have a home, and where the family would remain close together even after his death, building individual houses for each of his 4 children within walking distance of his own mansion. When the estate battle escalated and a judge issued a restraining order against Conway's children, Jimmy was among those forced to pack up and leave the only adult home he had ever known, along with his siblings and their 81-year-old grandmother. The emotional impact of being evicted from the property his father had designed as their permanent family sanctuary created wounds that would affect Jimmy for years to come. The situation became even more painful when all of Conway's personal belongings, awards, and family memorabilia were put up for public auction as part of the estate settlement process. Jimmy had to watch helplessly as strangers bid on his family's most intimate possessions, including private letters between his parents, photographs from his childhood, and the physical artifacts that represented his father's incredible career and their family's shared history. Despite the trauma of the estate battle, Jimmy has maintained his preference for privacy while still honoring his father's memory in quiet ways. He participated in family events related to Conway's legacy, including attending the ribbon-cutting ceremony in 2020, when the city of Hendersonville dedicated Conway Twitty Lane in Drakes Creek Park, showing that while he may not seek public attention, he remains committed to preserving his father's memory. Jimmy's approach to dealing with his father's fame represents a different kind of strength than his siblings chose, finding his own way to honor Conway's legacy through private remembrance rather than public performance. His deliberate choice to remain out of the spotlight while still supporting family efforts to preserve Conway's memory demonstrates that not all children of famous performers need to follow the same path, and that sometimes the most meaningful tribute can be living a life true to one's own values rather than trying to recreate someone else's success.